Limbic system, emotions. Rats. The olfactory bulb it's the 40% of his brain. The limbic system was called rhinencephalon, nose brain. The rat emotional world is utterly driven by olfactory information. Paul MacLean. The triune brain, three-layer model of brain function. One central, ancient, archaic, most phylogenetically conserved. The hypothalamus talking to the pituitary. Down the spinal cord, brainstem, midbrain. The reptilian part of the brain. Does the automatic regulatory things. Undine's curse. Some lesions, some stroke damage to one of these midbrain areas, which lose the capacity to do automatic breathing. Which affects you while you go to sleep, so you might die of asphyxiation, or sleep deprivation. 2. Limbic system. A mammalian invention. 3. Cortex. Cortical function and cognitive expertise. Invertebrates and mammals. The rational, independent, analytical part of the brain. Is completely wrong, because the cortical functions are influenced by hormones and thus, under the regulation of the limbic system, so it's able to influence decision-making on the cortex. Like thinking of the fact that you're not going to live forever, and suddenly it will release CRH. And you just do it with thought. Antonio Damasio, Descartes error. The idea of the separation between thought and emotion it's nonsense. Subparts of the limbic system. James Papez 1930s. The Papez circuit. A connection, a projection, are neurons in the brain, sending their axons to other parts of the brain, and forming synapses. What parts of the brain are talking to X region, and what parts of the brain is X region talking to? The limbic system is only concerned about telling the hypothalamus what to do. Because the hypothalamus is the central hub for all the endocrine stuff, it's also playing a pivotal role in the autonomic nervous system coming down the spine. So, the world in which emotions change how your body works, is all about the limbic system. Also, is making sure no other part of the limbic system is telling the hypothalamus what to do. Thus, you have certain areas stimulating regions of the hypothalamus, and inhibiting other limbic areas. This is done, knowing how many neurons are intervening between the limbic system and the hypothalamus. It means, the closer an area of the limbic system to the hypothalamus, the most direct influencing will have. Having as few synapses of your projection as possible. E.g. every single one of your sensory modalities has to go through a minimum of 3 or 4 synapses, to first plunk down any influence in the limbic system. Except for our olfactory systems, which are 1 synapse away from the limbic system, our olfactory system takes up less than 5% of our brain. That's why olfaction is the thing that flashes us back to some emotional setting. Fewer synapses equals more influence. Structures of the limbic system. Major structures, is the pituitary, on top of that, is the hypothalamus. Amygdala, you've got nuclei, cluster of neuronal cell bodies, and you have projections. One of the things that makes actions potential go really fast is by myelination, white in color. And cell bodies tend to be gray color. This is the dichotomy in brain science, between gray matter and white matter parts of the brain. Gray matter, are nuclei. White matter, are cables of axons going from one place to another, wrapped in myelin. Amygdala means almond. Hippocampus means seahorse. Septum. Septum is a term for a midline structure. Right at the midline of the midbrain. Mammillary bodies. Behind the hippocampus. Thalamus. Is on top of the mammillary bodies. Ventral tegmental area, and the nucleus accumbens. Frontal cortex. Walnata. Based on looking at the anatomy. He said that one part of the cortex should be classified as part of the limbic system. So, he predicted the frontal cortex, also called prefrontal cortex. Which includes a subarea anterior cingulate which is interconnected with all the subcortical regions. The cortical component of the limbic system. Doing, emotions regulation, impulse control, long-term planning, gratification postponement. The frontal cortex is what makes us most definitely human. Is the most recently evolved. Is the last part of the brain to fully mature, which isn't fully myelinated until your mid-20s. It does impulse control for you. Ian Dunbar. Looking to about 150 primate species, and asking what % of the brain is made up by the prefrontal cortex. Where the single best predictor of how big the frontal cortex was going to be, was how large is the average social group for the species. As a result, this part has evolved for gossip, social relations, appropriate behavior, social intelligence, etc. All these structures are areas where the cell bodies are nuclei. How these areas connect with each other. Amygdalofugal pathway. Carries information between the amygdala and hippocampus. Amygdala, fear, anxiety, learning to be afraid of particular stimuli. Hippocampus, remember stuff. So, the amygdala tells the hippocampus to do some memory formation about a fearful stimulus. Fimbria fornix, Fornix means arch. Hippocampus plus septum. Medial forebrain bundle. Septum plus hypothalamus plus mammillary bodies. Stria terminalis. Amygdala plus hypothalamus. These two parts are next to each other, but the amygdala does like a circle all around the limbic system, and then match to the hypothalamus. Which it means, that at some point embryologically, these two structures were not so close to each other, so the embryonic development flipped the parts, so now they're right next to each other. This shows how some parts within us are inefficient because of the embryological development. E.g. of the evolutionary history of the nervous system, is not related to the limbic system. Motor systems in the brain. If you only want to bend your middle finger, the logical things would be that some part of the cortex involved in motor control, sends a message down to the middle finger saying bend. But, that's not what happens. The pyramidal nervous system sends a message to all 5 of your fingers saying bend. Meanwhile another motor system, the extrapyramidal system, that quickly sends down a signal and says, if you hear the pyramidal system tells to fingers 1, 2, 4, and 5 to bend, don't pay attention to it. That's why you do weird things when you only try to bend one finger. Because, there's not a whole lot of species that have a need, in terms of reproductive success, to play trills on the piano. So, what you do is, to come up with a second, newer system that's superimposed on top. It means the extrapyramidal system is more recently evolved. All of these, is telling you about embryonic things and about evolution. Evolution is not an inventor, evolution is a tinkerer. It's playing with what's already there and trying to come up with something better. Mammillothalamic tract. Mammillary plus thalamus plus frontal cortex. Nucleus accumbens plus ventral tegmental area, it goes to every single place. The amygdala is trying to get the hippocampus to shut up, so the amygdala can dominate hypothalamic events. How you know the functions of the limbic system? People making studies with people with brain lesions, like him. And there's another person, N.A. His septum was taken out, because it was hit by a miniature fencing foil. By frontal lobotomies. Where they just destroy different parts of the brain. By experimental animals. They take some part of the brain, and they see what happens when one part is missing and so on. By putting an electrode where you stimulate that region, you artificially generate action potentials. By putting a recording electrode, generating some action potential and recording a different part of the brain. Or, patch clamping, people recording from one single ion channel at a time. Just looking at the circuitry telling you about function from that. Biochemical stuff. Image brain regions. CAT scans, CT scans, MRI. Thanks to this, we know the limbic system will change their size over time. E.g. 1. The amygdala gets bigger in people with post-traumatic stress disorder. Also, it's more metabolically reactive. So, periods of severe stress cause neurons in the amygdala to grow more dendritic processes. E.g. 2. In people with long-term, major depression, their hippocampus gets smaller. Limitations. It's harder to use these techniques, to make sense of emotions, emotional memories, etc. Because, in a lesion study, if something doesn't work, it's because you've taken out the neurons, or the cell bodies, or have you inadvertently cut a fiber passage. Lesions of nuclei vs lesions of pathways. If you figured it out, if you found the center. The cell bodies, rather than just the axons. Now, what does a center mean in the brain? Because, once you're getting to a part of the brain that's doing the emotional stuff, intermixed with sensory information, memories. You can't really find the actual center. Ethology. A lion, you stuck a stimulating electrode in the, you mildly stimulate this part of the brain. And the lion extends its claws. Now you stimulate the same part of the brain of a human, and he says shit. So, we found a part of the brain that express irritation. You've got to know your species, on their own language. E.g. 1. You do the same with rodents, but in another part of the limbic system, and he makes a nest. Then, you do the same with rhesus monkey, and she takes something and embrace it. So, that part of the brain is about mothering. E.g. 2. The hypothalamus, people thought it had everything to do with aggression. But they put the electrode in a rat. Then, they throw a mouse in the same cage. You stimulate that part of the brain. And the rat leaps on the mouse to rip it to shreds. Now, stimulate the same part on a human. And he will go run over to a cereal box and rip it open and start eating. So, rats eat mice, that was not a rat angry, it was a rat taking a snack. These people thought they were studying aggression, but they wind up studying predatory behavior. So, you have to make this kind of distinctions, the ethological principles. Know your individual. 2 lions. You stimulate a part, and he does his claw thing. Then you stimulate it even more, and he roars savagely. Meanwhile, you do the same with the second lion, and he does nothing. Now, do the same with baboons. And the same happens. It means. The first type, it's a dominant individual, and they do their fixed action pattern, for expressing aggression and dominance. The second type, it's a subordinate guy, so he doesn't do it. What the structures of the limbic system do. 1. Amygdala. Fear and anxiety. A central role in aggression, mediates aggression. Because, you cannot understand the neurobiology of being violent, without understanding the neurobiology of being afraid and anxious. Male sexual motivation, this might explain, individuals who confuse aspects of aggressive behavior and sexual behavior in pathological ways. 2. Septum, 2 synapses away from the amygdala. Inhibits aggression, when the amygdala is activated, it tries to silence the septum, and vice versa. 3. Hippocampus. Learning and memory. Turning off the stress response, it measures the levels of glucocorticoids, because in stressful and scary circumstances, it needs to remember what you did to get out of that situation. 4. Mammillary bodies. Maternal behavior. 5. Prefrontal cortex. Maturation. Learning appropriate sexual behavior. When to be aggressive. 6. Anterior cingulate. Empathy. Feeling somebody else's pain. Depression might be considered a disease of pathological hypersensitivity to the pains of life and the world. 7. Ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens. Depression. Neurons that release dopamine having to do with pleasure, where addictive drugs work on. Appetitive behavior. It activates when you're anticipating feeling pleasure, at the same, powering the behavior you need to do, in order to get the reward. It's giving you the energy, motivation, depolarization of neurons, for carrying out the pursuit of pleasure, because stimulating the pursuit of pleasure is more addictive than the pleasure itself. All of these plunks down into the hypothalamus, which has sub-areas, keeping track of everything, affected the world of emotions, thought and memory. Sub-areas. 1. Ventromedial hypothalamus and the medial preoptic area. Sexual behavior. There are gender differences in the size of these areas. Also depending on your sexual orientation. In transgender people, as a function not of what their sexual phenotype is, but on what they've always said, I have always felt like they have the size of the region what I always felt like I was rather than what they actually are. So, they are not thinking that they have the wrong sex, but it's somebody who's gotten the wrong body. 2. Suprachiasmatic nuclei SCN. Circadian rhythms. 3. Paraventricular nucleus PVN. Make CRH. 4. Arcuate nucleus. Is the bottom of the hypothalamic funnel, where all the hypothalamic hormones come out and get into the circulatory system. 5. Lateral hypothalamus. Hunger. Measure your blood glucose levels, and insulin levels. Limbic system - hypothalamus - hormones, or autonomic nervous system. Stuff going on in the body will influence limbic function. Completing the circle. How you feel an emotion. Your brain being influenced by your bodily state to decide what emotions it's feeling. E.g. 1. Adrenaline. Epinephrine, associated with arousal of the sympathetic nervous system. So, when you don't epinephrine into the nervous system. Stanley Schachter. He gave people epinephrine, adrenaline without them knowing it. Long-active epinephrine. Then, he seats them on the waiting room, there was somebody working on the experiment. One half will be stressed, saying he was delayed, missing his work, etc. And the other half will be happy, saying they love this experiment, etc. Totally different emotional states. So, epinephrine makes you friendlier, or angrier. No. It's modulatory. What it does, it kicks up the fevered level of whatever emotion you're socially being brought into. Does not cause a behavior, it exaggerates emotional states provoked for other reasons. E.g. 2. James Lang. You're terribly anxious. You go to a clinician and he gives you benzodiazepines, like Valium. It decreases your anxiety. Another guy, who has muscle spasms. He goes to a clinician, and he also gives them a benzodiazepines, is also a muscle relaxant. It's the exact same thing. It's getting feedback from the muscle tone in your body, coming back with autonomic information. E.g. 3. Meditation. You're having high blood pressure. You can take drugs, or do meditation. They sit you down, they tell you to relax and focus on the best day of your life, but nothing happens. To focus on your favorite song, but nothing happens. To focus on a childhood memory, and suddenly your blood pressure goes down. So, you're using that memory to send a signal to the limbic system, to do the feedback. E.g. 4. You're fighting with your mate. The fight goes on, she wins, you apologize, she forgives you. And suddenly, she remembers something you did 15 years ago, and goes mad. The problem is, it takes a long time for your sympathetic nervous system to go back to baseline. So, The problem is solved, but your heart is still racing, so your brain says, I was really upset about that, it's solved, but I'm still agitated, it must be for some reason. That's why she remembers the thing you did 15 years ago. We got again the same loop, of the physiological information coming back, trying to find a cognitive explanation for it. E.g. 5. There's a pronounced gender difference in how long it takes after strong sympathetic arousal for things to go back to baseline. Females. Also, after orgasm. Males go back to baseline a lot faster than females do. E.g. 6. Somebody with clinical depression. And you force him to smile repeatedly for 30 minutes. And he will feel better afterward. E.g. 7. Somebody slumped in a chair. Or sitting up erect. And you tell him the score that they got on a test, and it's a very good score. And you see, the more straight upright the person is sitting, afterward, the more they will assess themselves as being happy, and being made to feel proud. Next lecture. The world of ethological releasing stimuli. What hormones in the bloodstream in the last minute, hour, made the individual more sensitive to that sensory information?